So, thank you very much indeed for having me. Thanks to Roland, thanks to Oracle, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you this morning. So, I'm going to be talking a little bit about developing against Facebook. What does it mean as a developer to create social applications? And a little bit about our APIs, and specifically I'm going to be talking about one of our APIs, one of our sets of APIs called Open Graph. It goes without saying that Facebook is not an enterprise company, per se, but hopefully a lot of the philosophies that I talk about and lots of the principles of social design are applicable regardless of whether you are developing for internal enterprise customers or consumers. And obviously, enterprises are made up of real human beings who have a life outside of work as well as inside work. So a lot of what has worked at Facebook and a lot of what we've done hopefully will be applicable to those users inside as much as outside. So this is me. I like to get to the monospaced fonts as early as possible. And I'm responsible for developer advocacy, which means essentially going on the road and talking to coders, talking to people about developing against Facebook. I'm, by the nature of the job, easy to get in touch with, and you're very welcome to contact me on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. And really, I think my role is about trying to establish Facebook's reputation with developers and making sure you understand what we can do for you. And providing an environment where we prove that we can roll up our sleeves and hack with you and create code and give you whatever you need to be successful, and also hear about what works and what does not work when you're developing with Facebook. So really, we think there are three things. There are three parts to being a Facebook developer. We think there are three things that we can do for you. One is obviously that you're building applications, and we provide the APIs and the toolkits and the SDKs and the design principles to be able to do that. But secondly, Facebook offers the opportunity for your applications and for your efforts to be distributed. Now, we normally talk about that as being distribution out to almost 1 billion people. But even within an enterprise environment, distribution is key. How are you going to make sure that your users, whether they are employees or partners or clients or whatever, are being made available, or being made aware of what your applications do? And it turns out that the social concept is not just about providing a personalized experience for users, but it's also about allowing them to distribute their experiences or share their experiences such that their friends and their friends or friends of their employees or their employees of employees begin to learn what your application is doing for them, and in turn install it and so forth. And finally, Facebook also offers ads and promotion and various marketing-based channels for distributing and making people available or aware of the apps that you have available. I'm not going to talk too much about that third section. So really, when we talk about social, it's worth going back, 200,000 years and think about what humans have always done. And when there was a campfire out in the Serengeti somewhere, and there were two human beings on either side of this campfire, that, in a sense, was the first social network, two people. Not a very exciting social graph. I mean, it's two nodes with an edge between them, but those were the first humans, and what they were doing immediately was communicating, and they were telling stories to each other. And that, in a sense, defines who we are as a human species. We have this urge, this compulsion to tell stories. Why? I mean, it helps us to survive. And out in that kind of environment, the ability to tell stories and communicate with each other was how we knew where the best hunting was, and where the water was, and which berries not to eat, and so forth. So humans are programmed to tell stories. It's part of our identity. It's part of who we are. And so regardless of the technology that's available, whether it's a campfire or whether it's the printed word or whether it's TV or radio or the internet, we're programmed to tell these stories to define who we are. The strange thing is, actually, if you look at the web, 10, 15 years ago, the early days of the web, it was not actually a particularly strong medium for telling stories and, for expressing your social identity. The web was a very static and anonymous place. It was made up of millions at the time and billions now of web pages with links between them. It wasn't so much about humans telling stories to humans, it was about pages that were linked together and that you explored through the use of keyword search. It wasn't a medium that was pushing stuff to you as a human. It was a medium where you had to go and pull content. You had to go and look for things. You had to go and browse. It was about seeking. But of course the web has evolved, and over the last 5 years at least, it's become very clear that the web, and in fact technology in general, is orienting back around people, which is natural. That's what we've always wanted to do. We've always wanted to tell stories. We've always wanted our technology to work for us as a medium for telling stories. And so now the web is not a web where you necessarily open up a search engine and go looking for things that you think might be out there. It's a medium where you go to Twitter or to Facebook or to your RSS feeds or wherever, and you have content, in a sense, pushed to you by your friends, by your colleagues, by your family, etc., etc. And every single one of those experiences can, in theory, be personalized. You're not looking at the same web page as everybody else anymore. You're looking at a web page that's potentially customized, published for you. Gives you what you're interested in, and contains the stories that you see your friends telling. So anyway, that's a little bit high level, but ultimately what it boils down to as a developer is that you need to think about how you can offer that sort of experience to your users. And users have come to expect it. Employees of enterprises have come to expect that because of their outside lives. They are looking for every application to deliver to them an experience that's social, that is personalized to them. And if you can develop an app that has that social experience, if you can deliver to them an app that's going to allow them to tell a story, the great thing is that they're going to distribute those stories to their friends, who are in turn going to discover your service or discover your application. So it is literally a virtuous circle. You personalize the application, and in return, developers will help you to distribute it and get it discovered amongst their friends. Now, it's no coincidence that behind this picture I've placed a picture of, a metaphorical social graph. Because really, to be able to do this, personalize, and then have your app discovered, you've got to both read and write to that graph. So by pulling data out of a social graph, your application can be personalized, HTTP GET. And by posting data back into the social graph, that is letting people share things and tell stories, HTTP POST. They can then tell that story, or they can then help your app to become successful. And of course, that's why at Facebook we created a platform. Most people in the world think Facebook is a website, but we think it's a platform, and hopefully so do you. It is an opportunity for you to build these types of applications. And when we first launched the Facebook platform, well before my time, back in 2007, initially it was just about little apps running in an iframe on the Facebook.com website. And clearly the proliferation of early apps there was skewing towards games. Games, of course, are the ultimate social applications. That makes a lot of sense. And a lot of the innovation around social applications came from that gaming community. But clearly, these things can't just live inside a sandbox, can't just live inside the Facebook iframe. And so we worked hard to bring those same kind of capabilities to web apps wherever they were. So on your own domain, you can now obviously access the same Facebook APIs, the same Facebook platform. But look, the world is not about the web so much anymore, or exclusively anymore, and we clearly are seeing a huge, huge growth in mobile. I don't know whether it's occurred to any of you, but we are already living in the mobile age. The desktop age, well, it's kind of happened. And I think regardless of the type of developer that you are, and regardless of the stack that you're thinking about, or the environment, or the types of users you're developing for, you need to have mobile first and foremost in your mind. Either you're developing for mobile right now, or I can guarantee you need to be thinking about it very, very soon. And so we, as Facebook, have realized that, the mobile device is the ultimate social device. And we have a huge percentage of our user base that are using mobile devices to connect to their friends and their social experiences. Of course, that's why you bought the phone, right? It's for connecting to your friends. And so for developers, we're also making sure that we have this same platform available to them, regardless of whether they're building iOS applications, Android applications, mobile web applications, or whatever other native stack they choose. These folks also deserve, these users also deserve to be able to have those rich social experiences. And I just wanted to run through a quick example. This is not an enterprise example, it's a consumer example, but it's an example of how some of these concepts can be pulled together. This is Endomondo. So Endomondo is a fitness app, and of course there are many fitness apps in the world. But this is one I use, and the reason that I use Endomondo is not just because it's green and because it shows me, you know, how far I run. Of course, all fitness apps do that. It's not because it shows me a pretty map. All fitness apps do that. The reason I use Endomondo is that that's where my friends are. It is a fitness app that was built from the ground up as a social application. It wasn't just something they bolted on at the end. It's the second tab on the app here. It's a core part of the Endomondo experience for me to be able to see what my friends who also use Endomondo are doing. So I can obviously compete with them and I can do fitness challenges, etc., etc. And it makes it more fun. So all other things being equal, I will choose the version of the app that is social. That's just what I've come to expect from the modern world. What's really cool is that Endomondo has added this setting too. So not only can I share my stories about what fitness activity I'm doing to the other users of the Endomondo app, I can actually also share it to all of my friends anywhere on Facebook. Now obviously, the number of friends I have on Facebook is a superset of those that actually use Endomondo. But of course it's in Endomondo's interests for as many people to use the app as possible. So by doing this, I can share that story more broadly and help in turn to promote the Endomondo app. And in fact, my fitness, the stories that I tell about my fitness, they're such a kind of core part of my identity that I even put them on my Facebook timeline. So, you know, Facebook timeline, if you like, is the ultimate expression of me, which is curated by me. And so you can see the music I listen to, and you can see the friends I have, and the photos that I take, and the places I go to, and the pages I like, and the fact that I like Celine Dion. I keep meaning to Photoshop that out. But the Endomondo app is front and foremost on this timeline. It is who I am. It identifies me. I like people to know that I run and that I cycle. But that's awesome for Endomondo, right? Because their name is front and foremost on my page. And of course, if any of my friends click through, they're going to get taken through to the Endomondo app. And lower down my timeline, the Endomondo app is configured to actually tell these rich stories, and we actually call them stories. I mean, these rich panels about the activity that I'm doing. Here's that map on my Facebook timeline. Here's the aggregation of all the running I've done on my Facebook timeline. Here's the aggregation of all the cycling I've done on my Facebook timeline. And there's the Endomondo brand front and foremost. So, to summarize, I'm telling a story, and Endomondo is getting the distribution out of it. And that's the same on mobile as well as it is on desktop. And even if my friends haven't got the Facebook app, the Endomondo app installed, if they click on that story to go through to more detail, we're going to drive them to the App Store. So you can see how we're starting to drive distribution of this app on behalf of the developer, simply because that developer has made it easy to tell rich stories that developers want to, that users want to self-identify with. We also have an app center, which we use to provide a curated list of apps. I'm sure many of you have seen that. This itself is a social experience. We show which friends have used an app, and we rank apps based on which of your friends have used it. And I know there are many opportunities for enterprise app stores these days, and we hope that the same kind of concept comes to the enterprise too. If you're a very, very large organization and there are hundreds of apps available for employees to use, the ones that your colleagues and that your colleagues of colleagues are using are likely to be the ones that you should also be exploring. And so enterprise app stores that put the employee at the heart of that social experience are likely to be very successful. Of course, there's also the opportunity to send to mobile. And I just wanted to give you a scale of how this works for Facebook and for the developers that develop against Facebook. So using the technique, just like I showed there, whereby a story drives someone through to the native app store to install an app they don't already have, per month, we are driving at least 150 million users to both the Apple App Store or to Google Play. So for a developer, this is kind of a magical way to get your apps distributed if you have created a rich social experience. Now, 150 million seems like a big number to me, but I have to say, in the grand scheme of things at Facebook, it is actually, well, one of many big numbers. So the Facebook platform, as it currently stands, we have 955 million active users. That's on Facebook as a whole. But I did want to call out this particular stat, which is that of those users, well over half now are mobile monthly active users. So if any of you are in any doubt that we're moving into a mobile world, I guess Facebook traffic is a statistically valid sample. We have a huge, huge uptake. Users expect to be able to do everything on mobile. And that's not just going to be the case outside the enterprise. Okay, so let's actually drill into how some of this can actually be built. So you're all developers or you're coders and you're thinking, this is all wonderful, but how do I actually build this stuff? So I must have stood on something. What do I do to get that to come back? Take it out and plug it back in.
It didn't work.
Nearly worked.
Just keep going.
Do you guys mind slightly grey interlaced slides? Might improve them, actually. A little bit disconcerting. I hope nobody's epileptic. So we have, obviously, to be able to support this ecosystem of people building rich apps, we have a huge number of developer resources. And before we go any further, anyone that's interested in getting into this world, you should definitely live on developers.facebook.com. That is our entry point for everything that we provide to developers: documentation, resources, downloads, samples, etc., etc. Behind that, it works. It was just that slide. Behind that, our platform itself is obviously a very, very deep and rich and wide stack. And, it's almost at this point too large to be able to describe in a single set of slides. But our platform is a number of different things. When we talk about developing against Facebook, we're obviously talking about SDKs that we provide, and we provide SDKs for a number of languages. I'll talk about those in a moment. We provide a RESTful graph API to allow you to read and write data out of that social graph. It's HTTP-based. The SDKs ultimately are just a wrapper around that. We provide a query language called FQL, which looks a little bit like SQL, and it basically allows you to do more expressive queries onto the social graph. Authentication, an extremely important part of any social application, is to get the user to identify who they are and then give you the permissions to do the things you want to do. We use OAuth 2. Again, that can be kind of tricky. My brain doesn't wrap itself around OAuth very well, but the SDKs take care of all of that. We provide dialogues and plugins like the like button, I'm sure you've all seen, as well as a rich kind of object data layer underneath. And I'm going to talk about Open Graph in more detail later. And we have places and some other things that for some reason have been badly kerned, but events, what movies people like, their friends, obviously, their subscriptions and so forth. This is a bunch of data objects underneath, all of which are available through the Open Graph APIs. I'll start off by running through a couple of the important parts of that platform. Plugins are obviously the easiest one, and they are prevalent across the web in many, many ways, of course. So the like button, the comment button, the send button, the subscribe button. I am sure you have seen lots of these. This is a poor man's way to create a social app, chuck a like button on, but nevertheless it's a good way to get introduced to seeing what the benefits of creating a social experience can be for users. And some, like the comments plugin, allow you to add, rich interactive functionality to a static web page simply by embedding a little bit of JavaScript or a little bit of HTML5. It's a good way to start tasting what it means to create a social application. But really, ultimately, when it comes down to it, the exciting part of the Facebook platform is the Graph API, which is the RESTful interface to pretty much everything that we offer. Everything lives on graph.facebook.com. That is our main endpoint, HTTPS. And pretty much everything that ever comes back is JSON. And obviously, in a sort of a RESTful style. Gets stuff out, posts put stuff in, and the path of the URL indicates what it is that you're trying to do. So in this case, I am Facebook user 738229837, and a get to that URL will literally bring back my basic information, my name, where I live, etc., etc. The same sort of information that you would see if you went to my Facebook page, or the very simple part of it anyway. What's cool is that you can add extra sections to that domain on that path off to the right-hand side. So for example, /check-ins will tell you, it'll give you an array, a JSON-based array of all the places I've ever checked in. /locations will tell you all the places I've been. /work, I think, will give you all the companies I've worked for, and so forth. And in fact, you can even alias the user ID for just the word me. Now that, of course, emphasizes the fact that to get this stuff, you have had to have gotten the user to have logged in and to authenticate it against your app, and to have given you permission to get access to this information. So actually what happens is at the end of every single call you make, you have to append an access token, and the access token is the thing that identifies the user and identifies the permissions they have granted you. This is all just standard OAuth stuff. I'm sure you're all familiar with OAuth. We use OAuth 2, and we were kind of part of the group that put together OAuth 2 in the early days. It's still a little bit baffling, at least for novice developers, so we try to make it as simple as possible. Ultimately, what the user sees is a dialog box like this when you make a request to the OAuth endpoint, and the list of permissions that you're asking the user for appears on the right-hand side, and if they accept it, they simply add to Facebook, and that is then logging them in, and it is authorizing, or letting them authorize what permissions you've asked for. And so in fact what ends up happening is you get an access token which you can append to the end of all the graph API calls in order to prove who you are. Simpler than making raw HTTP calls, of course, is to use an SDK. We have 4 supported SDKs: Android, iOS, PHP, and JavaScript. I'm sorry to say we do not have a fully supported Java SDK. Nor, by the way, do we have an ASP.NET SDK, nor, in fact, do we have a Ruby SDK. But we work very closely with communities to create open source versions of these and to make sure that they're compliant with our APIs. At the end of the day, these are nothing more than glorified HTTP wrappers. So you can make calls to that API, and they just convert it into whatever behind the scenes, and they do the little bit of the OAuth up the front. So there's nothing magical about these particularly, but for developer convenience, they're obviously very important. The best that I know of, anyway, the best Java SDK for Facebook is SpringSocial. And in fact, I think it supports Twitter also, but that'll take care of the OAuth as well as the simple API calls. So just going to look on the front end first. One of the easiest ways to implement Facebook is actually not on the server side at all, but on the client side. And so for anyone building web apps, anyone building HTML5 apps, where you've got a rich JavaScript environment, this is pretty scary, but actually it's extremely simple. This is the small amount of DOM and the reasonable amount of JavaScript boilerplate required to pull in a JavaScript SDK. Now, the great thing about doing a JavaScript SDK approach is that the OAuth can work without having to do a sort of a second redirect. It's all kind of taken care of for you. You don't have to provide an app secret. This is literally boilerplate. You just copy and paste this off our website. But by inserting your Facebook app ID in the top right-hand corner, you've essentially provided all of the infrastructure on your web page in order to get users to log in and to grant permissions and then to subsequently make calls. I realize I'm bringing JavaScript to a Java conference, but anyway, trust me, it's pretty easy. And once you've done that, you're in a great position to do things like this, fb.login. That will log the user in. There's a callback, comes back as an object response. If they're authorized, you can then do, for example, fb.api/me. If you remember, that was the alias, meaning my user ID. And that will bring back some basic data, including the name, which is going to be easy enough for you to insert into some welcome message. So it's nothing clever. But this is, in a sense, the minimum viable social app that exists in the world. Get the user to log in, get permission to get their basic data, and customize the experience, personalize that experience. It's kind of what they expect. Even worse than bringing JavaScript to Java conference is bringing PHP to a Java conference, but anyway, sorry. Apart from the dollar signs, it's sort of, no, it's not at all similar. Anyway, yeah, that's heresy right there. But for those of you that can tolerate it, if you can stomach it for a few moments, this is the kind of concept on the server side. So there is obviously a two-stage process. You have a first page that has a login URL, which will take the user to Facebook to do the authentication, and then there'll be a callback, which will mean they get redirected back to your site, and the second page is the point at which you can then start calling against the API. We have a very, very simple way of invoking or including the PHP SDK into those pages. But yet again, there's a simple API method that just allows you to make all of these HTTP calls. And just for completeness, writing back to the graph, which is just as important as reading from it, is naturally going to be post-based, and here we are posting, in this case, a check-in. This is me checking in at work, passing some coordinates and a place ID, which happens to be our office, and that is writing back to the graph. And of course, assuming I've given the permissions for this, my users will be able to do this, and my friends will all be able to see the activity that they're doing. Now, the rest of it is up to you, so to speak. The rest of it is up to you in terms of creativity around, well, how can I create a social experience that is compelling and exciting for users to get them sucked in? The mechanics are extremely, extremely easy. A couple of important tools. We have on our dev site a range of tools. The one that you absolutely must use if you're doing anything with Facebook is the one at the top, the Graph API Explorer. And this is a sort of an interactive console where you can actually explore that API and see what's available and see the pretty printed JSON and be able to actually click on some of those links and kind of almost browse through the APIs, which is pretty cool. So any of you exploring that stuff will find that invaluable. And lots of sample apps as well. Maybe you guys are okay, but many of the developers we meet get freaked out by blank text editors at the beginning of the day. It's like, okay, well, we can start with something that already exists and work from there. How are we doing for time? Before I go any further.
I think we're doing fine. You still have 15 minutes.
Okay. So this is kind of the overview of the introduction to social apps, and also a very, very basic introduction to what building against the Facebook APIs look like. But I wanted to talk in a little bit more depth about something called the Open Graph. And the Open Graph is, well, it's relatively new. It's built on top of everything you've seen. But it's a new way in which we believe you can create strongly structured social experiences. And hopefully that'll make sense as I go through. So this is a social network. This is me at the middle of it. And clearly, you know, Facebook and other social networks are all about stitching people together with their friends. No big deal. When we launched the like button, we were providing, in a sense, this graph to connect up to web pages. So I can now say, I like the Coca-Cola web page, or I like the Starbucks web page. Pretty soon we realized that there needs to be a more expressive way of expressing opinions and actions against other objects in the world. You know, what would I do if I wanted to say I ate a meal, or ran a route, or read a newspaper, or listened to music? So Open Graph ultimately is about providing these extra verbs that I can say I'm using to act on an object. And in fact, the verbs that the graph can now describe are actually customizable by you, the developer. You can create, we call them action types. And if you think about what your application does and the things that people do in it, you can actually start to model, in a very, very semantic way, the actions that people are performing against objects in that social graph. There is more to life than like. And we launched this in October or September, late September last year. And it was no coincidence that we launched it at the same time that we launched Timeline. I'm sure all of you that have used Facebook have now seen Timeline. And Timeline is an interface that allows me to list out what I do in my life. And it's no coincidence that panels like this that show the music that I've been listening to are tied into this open graph concept, because listening is a verb. You know, I didn't just like this music, I actually listened to it at a given time. You know, here's one on the left. I'm going on a trip, you know, and the TripIt app is logging the fact that I'm about to leave. Well, that's a verb in a sense, right? I'm about to leave on a trip. So these strongly structured stories around strongly structured verbs and strongly structured nouns are now appearing in people's timelines. And again, it's a cross-platform story. As long as you have an app that's capable of posting HTTP and an app that's capable of reading it back out again, you have the opportunity to read and write these structured stories, regardless of the medium. And I'll just give you an example. This is obviously a consumer app, but this is SoundCloud. It's a website that allows you to upload and listen to WAV files. And if you spend any time on SoundCloud, you quickly realize there are 4 or 5 things that you do all the time. You play sounds, you like them, you post them. You follow other users, and you join groups. And so the SoundCloud development team has modeled these activities using Open Graph, and they've created those 5 verbs and a couple of nouns that correspond to them. And they can now post stories to Facebook about users doing each of these different actions. Clearly, you need to go through a permissions dialog as before, but you'll see on the right here that the permissions dialog now explicitly asks the user for permission to post the sounds you posted, the sets you posted, and more. So users are fairly familiar now, I think, with the concept that they can be posting these richer stories. And then within the SoundCloud app itself, oh, by the way, this is a general philosophy, you know, don't post things that users aren't expecting to have posted. It's very important that, you know, the user feels they have control over what stories or what activity they're sharing. SoundCloud is extremely good about this, so every one of their Open Graph verbs and objects that can be shared are configurable on or off. In fact, as an even more kind of general principle, when you're asking for permissions on this sort of dialogue, never overdo it. You know, even in a corporate environment, even in an enterprise environment, don't ask people for more permissions than you need, because users will generally get freaked out. Why did you need to know my religious affiliations? It will increase the drop-off for no noticeable reason. And in fact, the best practice is possibly to ask for, at any given time, the permissions you need just to do whatever the next thing is in an app. So when they first come to the app, just ask them for read permissions so you can get their basic data. When they come to publish a story, that's the time you ask them for publish permissions. And any of you that have got an iPhone with iOS 6 on it will have already seen, perhaps, that the Facebook integration in iOS 6 will always ask incrementally. As the app wants to do more and more, it asks for more and more permissions. And it's really just about giving the user comfort that this app isn't going to do anything that they're not expecting. That's just a general principle for OAuth in general. Never ask for too much too early. So in SoundCloud's case, they have a desktop app which posts Open Graph. They have a mobile web app that posts Open Graph, an iOS app, and an Android app, and in fact, even an OS X app. Basically, this just proves that all of those environments have HTTP clients. No news to anyone. But then those stories naturally going to turn up, in Facebook's case, on the Facebook timeline, newsfeed, ticker, and so forth. And what's cool, actually, is that the Open Graph protocol that underpins this is also now starting to be used by other social networks. So this is not, by the way, a Facebook silo. This is the same protocol that's being used in Twitter for their hover cards. It's being used by Google+, it's being used by LinkedIn, and in fact, I believe it's even being used in Windows 8. So this stuff is now becoming fairly well adopted.
Standardized anywhere? Yeah,
it's ogp.me. It's based on RDFA. It's an open web protocol doc. Obviously works on iOS. And again, you know, if the user does not have iOS, but they're being driven through to an Open Graph story, it will encourage them to install that application. I'm just going to quickly run through the steps, and for some reason we got the fuzz again. But let me just talk a little bit about how Open Graph actually works. First thing to do is obviously model the activity that your users do in their applications. What are the actions? What are the objects? What are the verbs and what are the nouns? If it's an HR application, you know, maybe the action is reviewed and the object is person. Perhaps a little bit of a contrived example.
For
Yeah, exactly. And in the Facebook world, the way that you configure this is literally in our app dashboard, where you come in as a developer to configure the app. You literally just press, create new action type, create new object type, and start to build up these semantic classes. So what are the types of thing that you create, and what are the types of things that users do on them? So the font is extremely small here, but this example here has an action type of cook. This is an app for cooking food. Cook, and then the object types are dishes. And dishes, in turn, are made up of ingredients. You can actually model object relationships. So lasagna is made of beef and cheese, and so forth. And you can have an open graph object for each of those. The second thing is you actually have to create the objects themselves, and these are actually exposed using the OGP protocol. So the markup that you would see there on a web page somewhere, living on a URI, describes these objects. So there would be a chocolate cookie object, which would have title of chocolate cookie, the image, some descriptions, any relationships to other objects. The lasagna dish would have its own web page with its own markup. And at the moment, anyway, this is the way that you create these objects. They have to exist as URI content, just like the semantic web and the RDF concept that underpins all of this. So this is a slightly clearer to read example. This would be my dish that I created, and I would be able to provide at the bottom references to the two ingredients that go into lasagna, as well as an image that I want to have representing my lasagna object. To actually get the user to express the fact that they did something to this object, it's an HTTP post, naturally. So posting to the social graph on Facebook in this case, / my namespace cook with the recipe object that I just created. This HTTP post is enough for that user to be able to say they cooked lasagna. Again, contrived example, but as I stressed, it's extremely easy to make these strong structured statements using HTTP only. Now, there is a challenge here, I guess, if any of you are using this kind of thing for an enterprise environment where the content is not public. As I caveated right at the beginning, we are not an enterprise company. But the way that this works is that when a user says they have acted on an object and you've posted that action to Facebook, Facebook naturally needs to come back and scrape that metadata. So the URL of this object needs to be publicly visible. Now that's okay when you're talking about lasagna and cookies and other stuff. I guess if you were trying to use Open Graph in a more sensitive environment, you would need to think carefully about what elements of an object, if any, you would want to expose externally. But for the applications that your enterprise's customers are using, there should be no issue at all. It just needs to be a public site. So Facebook will come back, it'll scrape the image, the title, any of those references, because of course that is the data that's going to appear in the stories that appear on their friends' timelines. And finally, the cool thing about Open Graph is that it's not just a write medium, it's also a read medium. And in a sense, we're creating a queryable semantic structure here. So you can get that graph and you can get back out again all the things that the user has done. So you can find out all the dishes they've cooked, all the movies they've watched, all the music they listened to, etc., etc. And this is obviously key to personalizing the experience again. An example might be, let's say you've spent a year using one music app, for example, and you've already listened to lots of music on that app. So that service has begun to build up an idea of what your tastes are and can customize playlists for you. What if you switch to another playlist, to another music app? In a sense, the music you've listened to, that's your data. As a user, that's your identity. So how can the other music app begin to tap into it? Well, now they can. If you give them permission, they can actually read out the list of music that you played in the past, despite the fact it was on a different app. And they, in turn, could provide you an immediately personalized experience.
Does Facebook have any restrictions similar to Twitter as to how to use this information?
We do obviously have policy for the platform in general. In this case, no, we do not. I mean, we have certain expectations of responsibility on the part of the developer. One thing, for example, might be if the user deauthorizes an app altogether, then that app has an obligation to remove the data that they've previously captured about the user. I'm not going to run through our entire policies here, but in terms of this Open Graph reading data, that's why it's called Open Graph. We do encourage, in fact, apps to read this out as much as they can in order to offer that personalized experience. So that's pretty much it, the summary for Open Graph. It was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it's given you a sense of how we think that apps can read and write this structured data in and out of an Open Graph environment. And I just want to conclude by, I guess, wrapping back to my first philosophical point, which is ultimately this is the way that users want to behave. And as developers, we have an obligation to provide apps that provide this social substrate, that provides this medium for them to better interact with their friends, their employees, their colleagues, etc. It's kind of what they expect, and you can make your app much more successful if you do. Provide a social experience for them. They, in turn, will tell stories and help you get your apps successful. And that, I think, is my time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. We do have a couple minutes, if you have a few minutes to maybe answer some questions. If there are any questions, if we can take some of those. Great, thanks. Go ahead.
So a few years back, OpenSocial was starting up. Is this related to OpenSocial, and it's still running in one way?
I'm unfamiliar, actually, where OpenSocial is right now. I mean, I mean, it was one of those kind of cross-industry attempts to sort of standardize around open standards for graph reading and writing.
Some IBM products are set to use it.
Right, okay.
Go ahead. There's another question right behind you. Yeah.
So in your step one about modeling your data, you had an actor and then modeling an object.
Yep.
Have there been any standards that have been created for standard structures of certain objects, like a song?
So we have a couple of globals ourselves that we've just seen lots of people using, so we've modeled them in a nice, kind of global way. So listening to music, so listen is a global action and music is a global object. Reading news, watching movies, we actually have a global object for, global action, for like and for following other people. And I'm going to imagine that over time, as we start to see common additional actions and objects, that we would look at wrapping those up into nice standard ways, which is particularly important when you're reading back out of the graph, because you don't want to have to try and guess what the actions were that were used in other places. But if you go to our dev site and you'll look at the list of globals, you'll see what we've done.
Great, Werner.
You mentioned SpringSocial as a way to bind in Java. Have you heard about probably the only other alternative API that is somewhat closer to the Java standards that Oracle is also proposing or promoting, like Java EE 6 and 7, called Agoraba?
I have not, but I will go and check it out.
Let's take that offline.
All right, fantastic.
Great. Anybody else? Okay, James, thanks very much.
Thanks very much, guys.